"Stop right there," the little girl said, and somehow her small voice cut through the whine of the drill, the clicking cameras, and the soft, polite laughter of people who had never been told no in their lives. Every head turned at once. The work crew froze beside the 20-foot bronze statue of Arthur Whitmore, their gloves dusty with pale stone powder, while the guests under cream-colored tints stared across the rain-dark lawn as if a shadow had spoken. Nia Brooks stood just beyond the velvet rope, 9 years old, skinny as a reed, her second-hand navy coat damp at the shoulders, her braids beaded with mist. Her sneakers were old, the white soles turned gray from the long walk up the estate drive, but her eyes did not move from the statue. "If you drill into it now," she said, breathing hard, "you'll bury the truth forever." For one suspended second, no one laughed, no one clinked a glass, no one whispered into a phone. Then the world started again. A woman in pearls drew in a sharp breath. One of the reporters lowered his camera and squinted. A man near the front gave a low, embarrassed chuckle, the kind rich people used when they wanted discomfort to sound harmless. At the center of it all, Graham Whitmore turned from the podium with the slow, careful stillness of a man used to controlling rooms by lowering his voice instead of raising it. At 46, he looked like money had shaped itself into a person. Charcoal suit, silver watch, posture clean and straight even under the gray afternoon sky. Rain beaded along the shoulders of his coat, but he didn't seem to notice. His late father's statue towered behind him, bronze and solemn on its marble base. One hand lifted as though blessing the sprawling estate, the hedge maze, the reflecting pool, the generations of power pressed into this land. The memorial banners rippled in the wind. Somewhere behind the guests, thunder muttered over the hills. "Whose child is that?" someone whispered. Nia heard it. She heard all of it. The questions, the disapproval, the careful distance in their voices, like she had tracked mud onto something sacred just by speaking. Her grandmother Loretta stood 50 feet away near the service path, still wearing her green gardener's jacket, one hand pressed flat against her chest. She had told Nia to stay by the side gate, to keep quiet, to wait until the ceremony was over. But that was before the men rolled the drill cart toward the statue, before the tarp came off the base, before Nia saw the crack in the marble seam and the small piece of tarnished brass wedged inside it like a tooth trying to break through stone. Graham's gaze settled on the girl. "Security," said a woman near him, too quickly. Evelyn Whitmore. She was elegant in winter white, her hair swept back, her smile perfectly arranged except for the corners, which had tightened ever so slightly. She did not look at Nia the way the others did. She looked at her the way people looked at smoke in a locked room. "Let's not make a spectacle out of this," Evelyn added, almost warmly, but there was something brittle under it. "She's just a child." Nia swallowed, then reached into her coat pocket with fingers that felt colder than the air. She pulled out the brass token and held it up. It caught the flat daylight with a dull, tired gleam. "I found this in the crack by the base," she said. "Right there." A few guests leaned forward. Graham took one step down from the platform. "Only one." "Bring it here," he said. His voice was calm, but the lawn had gone so quiet the words seemed to land on the wet stone and stay there. Nia looked at the guards, then at Graham, then walked under the rope herself before anyone could decide whether she belonged. Her sneakers made soft, damp sounds against the black slate path. Up close, the estate smelled like cut hedges, wet marble, and expensive perfume trying to cover the scent of coming rain. Nia stopped 4 feet from the Billionaire and lifted the token into her palm. Graham did not touch it right away. His eyes had already changed. On one side of the token was the raised image of a robin. On the other, etched in small, uneven lettering, were 5 words, "For the one who still listens." Graham went still in a way that made everyone around him shift. Not dramatic, not loud, just still. The kind of stillness that meant a door had opened somewhere deep inside him and cold air had started pouring through. His father used to say that line when Graham was a boy, back when summer afternoons meant scavenger hunts through the greenhouse and notes tucked into old birdhouses and pockets of garden walls. No one else knew that. No one. Not the reporters. Not the board. Not even Evelyn, whose face had gone pale before she fixed it again with a smile too polished to be real. Nia looked past Graham's tailored coat and square shoulders to the statue rising behind him. The robin token had been lodged in stone for who knew how long. Waiting for rain, waiting for a crack, waiting for someone small enough to notice what adults stepped over every day. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper, but it carried anyway. Your father hid something under that statue, she said. He didn't leave it for the people clapping. The wind moved across the lawn in one long breath, rattling the white tent poles, lifting the edge of the black memorial drape. Graham's eyes shifted slowly from the token in Nia's hand to the marble base behind him, then to Evelyn. And when he finally spoke, the softness in his voice was gone. Turn off the drill, he said, and don't let anyone leave. The drill went silent, but the silence that followed felt louder, sharper, almost unnatural, as if the whole estate had leaned in at once and forgotten how to breathe. Rain ticked softly against the white canopy above the guests. Somewhere near the valet circle, a car door shut, small and distant, but no one on the lawn turned toward it. All eyes stayed fixed on the little girl standing in borrowed shoes with a tarnished brass token in her hand, and on Graham Whitmore, who had not moved since reading the words scratched into the back of it. Evelyn recovered first. She always did. She stepped closer to Graham with the smooth grace of someone who had spent years mastering the difference between calm and control. Graham, she said quietly, as if speaking to him alone even though dozens of people were listening. This is a memorial, not a circus. Your father would have hated a scene. Her tone was gentle, almost affectionate, but Nia noticed the tightness around her mouth, the way one hand remained closed at her side like she was holding something invisible and sharp. Graham did not look at her. His eyes were still on the token. My father used to hide these, he said at last, more to himself than anyone else. Only for family. A murmur rippled through the crowd, quick and hushed. Reporters exchanged glances. One of the board members, a silver-haired man in a navy overcoat, shifted his weight and cleared his throat as if he wanted to remind everyone what events like this were supposed to look like. Clean, elegant, contained. But the day was already slipping loose from its script. Nia stood very still, afraid that if she moved too much, someone would remember she was just a kid and send her back outside the gates where children like her were expected to disappear into the edges of the property. Her fingers felt numb from the cold. She tucked them into the sleeves of her coat after Graham finally took the token from her palm. He turned it once, slowly, the dull metal catching a wash of gray light. Where exactly did you find this? He asked. Nia pointed to the statue base. In the crack near the left side, right above the bottom seam. I saw it when the tarp came off. Graham followed her finger. The marble pedestal looked immaculate from 10 feet away, but up close there it was, a thin dark line, barely visible where two slabs met near the foundation. Water had settled in it from the morning rain. It did not look important. That was probably why it had gone unnoticed. Nia knew better. Small things were the ones people stepped over. Loretta had taught her that. Lost buttons, bent keys, half-heard words. A rich family's secrets were usually hiding in the places where no one bent down unless they had spent their whole life picking things up for somebody else. This is getting ridiculous, Evelyn said, her voice firmer now. A child finds a trinket in a crack, and suddenly we are stopping construction? She gave a thin smile toward the guests, inviting them back into her version of reason. Arthur collected odd little objects. He was sentimental about all kinds of nonsense. Nia looked at her then. Really looked. Evelyn's coat was spotless despite the damp air. Her earrings were tiny diamonds, sharp with cold light. She stood close enough to Graham to seem supportive, but not close enough to touch him. And she had not once looked at the statue itself. Only at the people around it. Only at the reactions. Nia felt something small and certain settle in her chest. It is not just the token, she said before fear could stop her. Graham turned back to her. What else? The question landed on the lawn and held there. Nia swallowed. The wind tugged at the ends of her braids. Last night it rained hard, she said. I came with my grandma to bring in the garden tarps by the greenhouse. I was cutting across the side path when I heard a hollow sound under the stone. Like when you knock on old floorboards and one part sounds different from the rest. A few faces in the crowd changed then. Not belief yet, but attention. Graham's expression tightened. You were on the grounds after dark? Loretta stepped forward at once, her voice low with worry. Sir, if she wandered, that is on me. She was only helping. Graham lifted a hand without turning. Not dismissive. just enough to stop the apology before it bent too far. Nia kept going. I thought maybe it was drainage pipes, she said. But then I saw the seam. And this morning, when they pulled the black cloth off the base, I saw the brass in the crack. Then I remembered what my grandma used to say. Graham finally looked at Loretta. She lowered her eyes. And what is that? He asked. Nia answered for her. That people with too much money bury ugly things under pretty ones. No one laughed this time. The sentence moved through the air like a draft under a door, cold and undeniable. Even the reporters did not speak. Evelyn's face changed almost imperceptibly, not enough for most people to catch it, but Nia did. A flicker, a pulse of something harder than annoyance. Graham took one slow breath. Then he handed the token to his chief of security. Get everyone off the immediate lawn, he said. No one touches that base until I say so. And I want the house cameras from last night pulled now. The board member in the navy coat stepped forward. Graham, be careful. The press is here. Graham finally looked up, and whatever had been shifting inside him was now visible in the set of his jaw. That is exactly why I am being careful, he said. Then he looked down at Nia, not over her. Not past her, but directly at her for the first time. The rain had started to fall a little harder, dotting the dark fabric of his shoulders. You said it sounded hollow, he said. Can you show me exactly where you were standing when you heard it? Nia nodded once. The lawn, the guests, the cameras, the polished shoes, the marble angel faces carved around the reflecting pool. All of it seemed to fade at the edges as she turned toward the statue and took a few careful steps forward. Behind her, the memorial banners snapped in the wind. Above them, thunder rolled again, closer now, and the bronze face of Arthur Whitmore watched over them all with a silence that no longer felt noble. It felt like waiting. The marble was slick under Nia's sneakers as she led Graham Whitmore around the front of the statue, past the polished brass plaque and the arrangements of white roses beginning to sag in the rain. The workers had backed away. The guests had been moved beneath the tents and colonnade, but they had not gone far. Wealthy people rarely did when scandal brushed close enough to warm their skin. They watched from a careful distance, coats buttoned, phones lowered but ready, their voices hushed into that special kind of whisper meant to sound respectful while carrying perfectly across a wet lawn. Nia could feel those eyes on the back of her coat as she reached the left side of the pedestal and stopped. Up close, the statue did not look grand anymore. It looked heavy, too heavy. The bronze shoes of Arthur Whitmore stood planted above them on the stone base, as if even in death he expected the ground to obey him. Rainwater traced thin lines down the marble seams and gathered at the corners. Nia crouched and pointed to a spot near the foundation where the stone darkened unevenly. Here, she said. This is where I heard it. Graham stepped beside her, lowering himself just enough to examine the base without kneeling. His suit pants would have brushed the wet slate if he had gone any farther, and Nia had the strange thought that maybe this was the closest a man like him ever got to the ground. The chief of security handed him a flashlight. Graham angled the beam toward the seam. The pale circle of light skimmed over rain, mineral streaks, and then stopped on something almost invisible unless you were looking for it. A shallow scratch in the marble. Not random, not weathered. A shape. Small wings. A robin. Graham's breath changed. Not loudly. Just enough for Nia to hear it in the rain. That mark was not there when the stone was installed. One of the workers said from behind them. He was a broad man in a yellow rain shell, cap dripping at the brim, and he sounded less defensive than uneasy. We inspected all four sides this morning. Graham did not answer. His thumb brushed the air near the engraved bird without touching the stone. Nia saw something shift across his face then, not grief exactly, and not memory alone. It was the look of a person beginning to realize that something he once believed belonged only to childhood had survived him and waited. My father used robins as trail marks, he said quietly, when he wanted me to keep going. Evelyn, still standing beneath the edge of the tent, let out a soft breath that almost sounded amused. Arthur also played games when he was bored, she said. You are assigning mystery to sentiment, Graham. But her voice had thinned. The confidence in it no longer spread. It only skimmed the surface. Graham rose slowly and turned to the work crew. I want the ground sounding kit brought here, he said. Now. The foreman hesitated. Sir, that equipment is in the maintenance barn by the East Drive. 10 minutes, maybe 15. Then get it, Graham said. No one argued after that. The men moved quickly across the lawn, boots sinking at the edges where the grass had turned slick with rain. Nia stayed where she was. Loretta came to her side at last, her gardener's jacket dark with water and her lined hands smelling faintly of damp rope and rosemary stems. She touched Nia's shoulder with light fingers, the way she did when she wanted to steady her without making a fuss in front of strangers. "You should be under cover, baby," she murmured. Nia shook her head. "Not yet." Loretta glanced at Graham, then at Evelyn, then back at the statue. Her mouth tightened. She had worked around estates and old money long enough to know when a family's silence was starting to crack. "What made you look so hard in the first place?" she asked, low enough for only Nia to hear. Nia kept her eyes on the seam. "Because it did not feel right." Loretta did not smile. She understood that answer better than anyone. Nia had always been that kind of child. The kind who noticed when a room went quiet too fast. The kind who could hear the difference between a floor vent rattling from age and a cupboard door left open on purpose. Since she was little, she had paid attention to sounds adults dismissed because adults only trusted what arrived loudly enough to inconvenience them. Last night, after the storm rolled over the hills and knocked the garden lights out for a minute, Nia had crossed the side path carrying folded tarps for her grandmother. The statue had stood half covered in black fabric then, waiting for this morning's dedication. The wind had pushed the tarp just enough to expose the lower marble. She had set the tarps down to fix the loosened tie, and that was when she heard it. Not a clang, not a pipe. A low, boxed-in echo, almost like knocking on a wall with a room hidden behind it. She had stood in the rain and listened twice more until her coat sleeves were soaked through. The sound had stayed the same. Hollow. Waiting. Now, under the gray afternoon sky, the equipment arrived in a wheeled case dragged by two workers whose shoulders were already wet through. One of them knelt by the base and unfolded the compact scanner with practiced hands, its black screen flashing blue against the dim day. The guests pressed closer under the tents. A reporter took one step forward and was stopped by security. The machine was passed slowly over the lower marble, left to right, then again. Water beaded on the casing. The operator frowned and adjusted a dial. Everyone seemed to lean in without moving. Then a sharp tone broke the air. The worker looked up. "There is a cavity under this section," he said. "About 3 feet wide, maybe more. It is not solid beneath the center line." No one spoke. For a heartbeat, even the rain seemed to soften. Graham stared at the marble as if it had just answered a question he had spent years refusing to ask. Under the tent, one of the board members muttered something about legal exposure. Another asked whether this was some kind of old drainage vault. Evelyn stepped forward at last, the edge of her white coat brushing the wet stone. "That is impossible," she said, and this time there was no warmth in her voice at all. Arthur would never have approved a void beneath a memorial structure. Graham turned his head slowly toward her. "You signed off on the final redesign after his death," he said. "Did you know there was space under it?" Evelyn's expression held for half a second too long. Then she gave the tiniest lift of one shoulder. "Of course not." Nia looked from one face to the other and felt that same small certainty grow heavier in her chest. The hollow place under the statue was real. The token had been real. The robin mark was real. And now, for the first time, the fear in Evelyn Whitmore looked real too. Graham faced the crew again, his voice lower now, steadier in a way that made everyone nearby go still. "Remove the front panel," he said. "Carefully. No damage, no shortcuts." The worker nearest the base nodded and reached for his tools. Nia took one involuntary step closer. The statue rose above them, rain streaking down Arthur Whitmore's bronze face like tears no one had permission to mention. Somewhere behind the clouds, thunder moved again, slow and rolling. Metal touched stone, and Evelyn Whitmore, who had been composed all afternoon, whispered just loud enough for Nia to hear. No, the first tool touched the marble with a thin metallic click, and the entire lawn seemed to tighten around the sound. No one under the white tent spoke now. The polite murmurs had vanished. Even the reporters, who usually lived off interruption, stood with their microphones lowered and rain collecting on their shoulders. The worker at the base of the statue adjusted his grip and slid the narrow extraction blade into the seam with the patience of a man who understood that one careless move could cost him his job, his reputation, or both. Nia stood beside Loretta, her damp sleeves pulled over her hands. watching the blade disappear into the stone line where the robin mark sat just above it like a warning left by someone who knew exactly how long truth could sleep under money. Graham Whitmore had not moved more than a few inches in the last minute. He stood with one hand in his coat pocket, the other hanging at his side, his face unreadable except for the set of his mouth. Evelyn, by contrast, had gone too still. It was the wrong kind of stillness. Not calm, not grace. It was the stillness of a person trying not to look where everything was happening. Nia noticed that before anyone else did. Evelyn kept her chin lifted, eyes on Graham more often than the workers, as if the real danger was not under the statue, but in whether he would trust what came out of it. The blade slid deeper. A second worker brought over a rubber mallet and tapped the handle twice, lightly, enough to separate what had been sealed. The marble answered with a small, dull crack, not a break, more like the sound of something old finally giving way. A breath ran through the crowd. Graham stepped forward. Security shifted at once, not to stop him, only to clear the line of sight. The worker paused and looked up. "It is loosening, sir," he said. Graham gave one nod. "Keep going." Rain moved in fine silver lines through the air, catching against the black umbrellas and the bronze folds of Arthur Whitmore's sculpted coat. Water rolled from the statue's elbow and dripped onto the base with patient, steady taps. Nia could smell wet stone now, sharp and earthy, different from the trimmed hedge scent of the front lawn. The front panel of the pedestal lifted less than half an inch at first, then another inch, enough to reveal darkness behind it. Not the dark of shadow alone. A contained dark. A space. The worker froze and leaned closer. The second worker shined a flashlight into the opening. Its beam vanished into black, struck something flat and metallic, then bounced back in a pale glint. "There is a compartment," the man said, his voice almost swallowed by the rain. The words seemed to move across the lawn slower than they should have, as if nobody there had language ready for them. A compartment. Inside a memorial base. Inside a structure approved, polished, celebrated, and presented as a permanent tribute to legacy. One of the board members swore under his breath. Another took his glasses off and cleaned them even though rain had already spotted the lenses again. Under the tent, someone whispered, "My God." Evelyn found her voice before anyone else did. "Close it," she said. Not loudly. That was what made it cut so cleanly. "This has gone far enough." Several heads turned toward her. Graham did not. He kept staring at the black slit behind the loosened marble as though his father's voice might come through it next. "No," he said. "Just one word. Flat. Final." Evelyn stepped toward him, the hem of her white coat darkening at the edges where it brushed the wet stone. "Graham, think," she said, lower now, urgent enough to lose some of its polish. "There are donors here. Press. Your father's name is on every camera feed in the state by now. If there is some old box or damaged utility line in there, you do not want this circus unfolding in public." Nia watched Graham's profile. The rain had slicked his hair darker at the temples. He looked older than he had an hour ago. Older and somehow less protected by the sharp tailoring and the neat architecture of wealth. "You seem very certain there is nothing worth seeing," he said quietly. Evelyn stopped walking. For the first time all afternoon, she had no smooth answer waiting. The worker at the base cleared his throat, careful, professional. "Sir, I can widen the opening by another 2 inches without damaging the panel." Graham nodded again. "Do it." The mallet tapped softly. The panel shifted farther. This time the flashlight beam found more than metal. It caught the corner of a steel case, dark gray, rectangular, fitted tightly into the cavity like it had been measured for the space. Water had not reached it. Dust had. Fine pale dust ringed the edges, untouched until now. The worker leaned back and looked up. "It is a box, sir. Steel lock case. Maybe 18 inches wide." Nia's heart began to pound so hard she could feel it in her throat. Loretta's fingers tightened over her shoulder. The crowd behind them pressed closer without meaning to. Wealth had its own gravity, and secrets had more. Graham crouched at last, one knee bending near the wet slate. Expensive fabric be damned. The movement alone made several people stare. Men like him did not kneel in front of problems. They summoned other people to do it. But now he lowered himself into the rain and angled the flashlight into the opening with his own hand. The white beam crossed the steel surface, the latch, the sides, then stopped on a strip of yellowed masking tape attached across the top. There was writing on it. Faded, but still there. Graham's breath caught. Nia could not see the words from where she stood, but she saw what they did to his face. It was not shock alone. It was recognition sharpened into something painful, something intimate. His shoulders went rigid. "What does it say?" asked the silver-haired board member, unable to help himself. Graham did not answer immediately. Rain tapped against stone. The workers waited. Security waited. The reporters did not dare push in. Even Evelyn said nothing now. Graham read it a second time, slower, as if the letters might change if he looked too quickly. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough at the edges. "It is my father's handwriting," he said. Then he looked up, not at the guests, not at the board, but at Nia. The little girl standing in soaked sneakers with her braids damp against her coat and her eyes fixed on the darkness under the statue. "It says," he continued, each word distinct in the cold air, for Graham. "Open this only when you finally doubt the right person." The wind moved hard across the lawn then, flattening the memorial ribbons and sending a shiver through the white tents. Somewhere behind them, a glass hit the stone and rolled. No one turned. Nia looked at Evelyn. The color had drained from the woman's face so completely now that her lipstick seemed too bright against it, too carefully alive. For one suspended moment, all the polished wealth on that estate felt thin as paper. The statue, the flowers, the cameras, the speeches waiting unfinished on the podium, all of it had been built to honor certainty. But the steel case under the marble had not been left for certainty. It had been left for doubt. And as Graham rose slowly from the rain with the flashlight still in his hand, the first true crack in the Whitmore legacy was no longer hidden underground. It was standing in plain sight, wearing white, and trying very hard not to tremble. Graham did not hand the flashlight to anyone. He kept it in his grip as the workers carefully widened the opening and slid the steel case toward the edge of the hidden compartment inch by inch, the metal scraping softly against stone with a sound that made the guests under the tents go even quieter. Rain continued to fall, thin and steady now, not heavy enough to drive anyone inside, only enough to make the marble gleam and the flower petals sag against their ribbon ties. Nia stood so still beside Loretta that she could feel every beat of her own heart in the cold space behind her ribs. The case was real. The handwriting was real. And whatever Arthur Whitmore had hidden had not been meant for the polished people standing beneath cream-colored canvas, pretending legacy was the same thing as goodness. It had been meant for doubt. Graham knelt again and reached into the opening himself, ignoring the worker who half lifted a hand to stop him. The steel case was heavier than it looked. The muscles in his jaw tightened as he pulled it free and set it on the wet slate in front of the pedestal. Water beaded across the flat top and slid around the strip of yellowed masking tape with the message in his father's hand. For Graham, open this only when you finally doubt the right person. The sentence lay there between them all like a key and an accusation. "We should take this inside," said the silver-haired board member, his voice hushed but urgent. "Now, before this gets worse." A younger man beside him nodded quickly. "He is right. We can secure the estate and issue a statement later." Everything in their tone was about containment. Not truth. Never truth. Nia knew that sound too. Adults used it when they wanted to wrap ugly things in careful language and call that wisdom. Graham did not look up. "This is already worse," he said. "And I think everyone here knows it." Evelyn's heels clicked across the wet stone as she came closer, elegant and pale and controlled in the way people became when they were losing it in slow motion and knew others were watching. "Graham," she said, lowering her voice. Whatever Arthur left behind was clearly written in a state of suspicion. You know how he was toward the end. He saw betrayal everywhere. He was grieving. He was tired. He did not always think clearly. Nia felt Loretta's hand tighten on her shoulder again. Not because of the rain. Because of that sentence. It was not just denial. It was strategy. The soft kind. The dangerous kind. Graham lifted his head slowly. "That is interesting," he said. "You spent a year telling people my father was sharper than ever in his final months. You said that every time the board questioned the redesign, every time the trust changed hands, every time the memorial budget doubled." Evelyn's face held, but only barely. The guests could hear it now too, the shift beneath the words, the smooth family grief turning into something colder and much more expensive. A reporter by the far tent lifted his phone a little higher. Security moved toward him. Graham raised one finger without turning around. "Let him record," he said. That landed harder than shouting would have. Even the rain seemed to pause on the edge of it. Men like Graham Whitmore protected image before anything else. For him to let the cameras stay meant one thing only. He was past preservation. He was listening to something older now. Something buried. He set the flashlight down beside the case and brushed water from the latch with his thumb. "Do you know the combination?" asked the chief of security. Graham gave a faint, humorless breath that was not quite a laugh. "If my father left this for me, then yes. Or he expects me to." He ran his fingers along the side panel and found a recessed dial beneath a steel lip. For numbers. Old-fashioned. Mechanical. He stared at it for a moment without moving. Nia watched his face, the way memory moved across it like shadow under water. Rain darkened his suit at the knees. His hair had fallen slightly out of place, and somehow that made him look less like the man from magazine covers and more like someone's son standing in front of a door he had not been ready to open. "He used dates for everything," Graham said quietly. "Birthdays, anniversaries, milestones, things he thought mattered because they made a story sound neater." His hand hovered over the dial. "But if you wanted me to think, then it is not a birthday." He turned the first number. The metal clicked softly. Nia did not know the number, but she knew the sound of everyone around them leaning closer without stepping forward. Second number. Third. Fourth. Then Graham stopped. His hand had gone still. "What is it?" asked Loretta, before she could stop herself. Graham did not answer immediately. He looked up at the statue, at the bronze face of his father wet with rain, and something changed in his eyes. Recognition again. Sharper now. "It is the date the city shut down Franklin Row," he said. The name meant nothing to some of the guests, but not to Loretta. Nia felt her grandmother's fingers twitch at her shoulder. Franklin Row had meant something once. Old brick storefronts. A church with blue doors. A block where black families had run barber shops, bakeries, and a corner pharmacy before redevelopment came through with folded maps and smiling men in dark coats. Nia had heard the name at her grandmother's kitchen table in the kind of silence that came after hard memories. Graham turned the final digit. The latch gave with a clean metallic pop. No one breathed. For one suspended second, the whole Whitmore estate seemed held together by that tiny sound. Graham lifted the lid. Inside, protected beneath a layer of waxed cloth, lay three things. A digital voice recorder. A thick stack of folded documents tied with faded blue ribbon. And on top of them, placed deliberately where it would be seen first, a black and white photograph. Graham picked it up with hands that were suddenly less steady than before. The edges of the photo were worn soft with age. Rain touched one corner and darkened it instantly. Nia could not see the whole image, only shapes at first, but then Graham tilted it slightly, and the faces came into view. Arthur Whitmore, decades younger, standing in shirt sleeves on a city sidewalk. Beside him, smiling at something outside the frame, were a row of black shop owners in front of old brick storefronts with hand-painted signs. One of the women had Loretta's exact eyes. Loretta made the smallest sound then, not loud enough to interrupt the rain, but loud enough for Nia to hear. "Oh no," she whispered. Graham looked up at her. "You know this place?" Loretta's face had gone still in the way older people did when the past walked back into the room wearing its original clothes. "I know that block," she said. "And I know that woman." Her voice thinned. "That is my mother." The guests under the tents shifted again, but now the sound was different. Not curiosity, not gossip, discomfort. The documents in the case were no longer abstract. They belonged to somebody. They had roots. Evelyn's hand tightened around the edge of her coat. "This proves nothing," she said, too quickly, too sharply. Graham turned his head toward her with the photograph still in his hand. "Then why are you afraid of it?" he asked. Evelyn opened her mouth, but no answer came. Nia looked at the voice recorder resting in its velvet-lined cutout, rain light flickering on the small plastic screen. It felt wrong that something so small could make the whole estate tilt. But she knew by now that the smallest things were the ones that changed everything. Graham lowered the photograph slowly, his eyes no longer on Evelyn, no longer even on the board or the reporters or the guests standing trapped between courtesy and dread. He was looking at the recorder, at the documents, at the life his father had hidden under 30,000 pounds of marble and bronze. When he spoke again, his voice was low enough that people had to strain to hear it. "Get everyone inside the East Hall," he said. "No one leaves. No one touches a phone. And somebody bring me a dry cloth." He reached for the recorder, then stopped just before his fingers touched it, as if he already understood that once his father's voice entered the rain-dark afternoon, there would be no putting the Whitmore name back the way it had been an hour ago. They moved into the East Hall like people entering a church after a storm, quiet but not peaceful, carrying wet coats, damp hems, and the brittle energy of a room that knew its own history had just shifted under its feet. The Whitmore estate looked different from the inside once the rain was behind the glass. The marble floors reflected chandelier light in long pale bands. Oil portraits watched from paneled walls. Fresh lilies in silver bowls gave off a sweetness that could not quite hide the smell of wet wool and stone carried in from the lawn. Nia had never been this far inside the main house. Usually she saw only the service corridors, the mudroom by the garden entrance, the back pantry where deliveries were checked. But now she stood near the edge of the great East Hall with Loretta beside her, both of them leaving small damp prints on. A floor polished for people who never expected to be interrupted by truth. The guests gathered in uneasy clusters beneath the vaulted ceiling, no longer smiling for one another, no longer performing grief. Reporters had been separated from the board members. Security stood by the double doors with the stillness of men trying to look invisible while controlling everything. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock began striking the quarter hour, its tone low and old and impossibly calm. Graham Whitmore stood at the far end of the room near the fireplace, the steel case placed on a long walnut table beneath a portrait of his father. The contrast was almost too neat. Arthur Whitmore in oils above, stern and permanent. Arthur Whitmore in paper and plastic below, hidden, waiting, inconvenient. A housemaid brought a folded dry cloth and set it beside the open case with trembling hands before hurrying away. Graham dried the voice recorder carefully, not tenderly, but with the precision of a man buying himself 3 extra seconds before the world changed again. The stack of documents remained tied with faded blue ribbon. The black and white photograph lay beside them, now dry except for one darkened corner. Loretta had not stopped looking at it since they came inside. Nia could feel the older woman's silence like a held breath. Across the room, Evelyn stood alone for the first time all afternoon. That, more than anything, made her look smaller. She was still elegant, still perfectly dressed, but without her audience close around her, without the momentum of ceremony and scripted sympathy. The brightness of her coat seemed almost severe against the dark wood and cream walls. She had asked twice to speak with Graham privately. Both times he had ignored her. The guests noticed that. Wealthy people always noticed when power changed temperature. Graham pressed the small play button. At first there was only static, a faint hiss of age and stored air. Then the room filled with the voice of Arthur Whitmore, older than in the speeches they replayed every year at foundation dinners. Thinner, roughened by fatigue, but unmistakable. Several people in the hall straightened involuntarily, as if the dead had entered in person and expected the room to rise. "If you are hearing this, Graham," the recording said, "then you finally doubted the person I could not make you doubt in time." No one moved. The fire snapped once behind the iron grate, and the sound felt almost rude against the voice. Graham did not blink. His hand rested flat on the table beside the recorder as though he needed contact with something solid. Arthur continued, "I do not know how much of this estate will still belong to truth by the time you open this. I only know that I was too late in more ways than one." The tape crackled softly. There was a pause, a breath, the small scrape of paper near a microphone. "You were taught to believe our family built things. Schools, clinics, parks. You were not taught what was clear to make room for some of them. You were not told whose names disappeared from deeds, leases, and block records when Franklin Row became an opportunity instead of a neighborhood." Nia looked up sharply. Around the room, faces changed. Some because they recognized the name. Some because they did not and could already tell they should have. Loretta closed her eyes for 1 second only, then opened them again. The recording went on. "I signed papers I should not have signed. I told myself redevelopment was progress. I told myself the city would be kinder than the rumors said. I told myself I could fix the damage later with grants and donations and scholarship dinners. That is the lie wealthy men love most. that charity can arrive after harm and still call itself clean. A silence deeper than politeness settled over the East Hall. Even the reporters seemed to understand this was no longer spectacle. It was confession. Graham's face did not collapse or harden. It changed in a subtler way, like a man discovering that a wall he leaned on all his life was never load-bearing at all. Evelyn took one step forward. "Turn it off," she said, not loudly, but the room heard her anyway. Graham did not touch the recorder. Arthur's voice kept going. "If Evelyn is standing near my memorial when this is played, listen carefully to what she denies first. She always protects the newest version of the story, never the oldest one." Several heads turned toward her at once. This time there was no hiding it. Color left her face in a clean sweep, leaving her features too sharp under the chandelier light. "This is absurd," she said. Arthur was sick. He was paranoid. Everyone in this room knows that. "Do they?" Graham asked, finally looking at her. His voice was quiet, which made people lean closer. "Because until 20 minutes ago, you kept telling us he was meticulous to the very end." Arthur's recorded voice resumed before she could answer. "The documents in this case contain the original land transfers, side agreements, and a private memorandum prepared after complaints were filed by business owners on Franklin Row. I paid to bury them. Later, I paid to pretend I regretted it in all the respectable ways. But there is one thing I did not know when I signed those papers. One thing I learned too late." The tape hissed again. Nia could hear her own breathing now, thin and quick. Arthur spoke more slowly this time, each word carrying the weight of a man arranging truth after running from it too long. "The final shell company used to clear the block was connected to Evelyn before she ever joined this family. She knew what that corridor was worth long before I did. And after the complaints began, she pushed hardest to make sure nothing survived that could reopen the case." A murmur broke through the room at last. Not loud, but real. Shock moving across polished surfaces. Evelyn laughed once, a short, brittle sound that belonged to a stranger. "A dead man's recorder is not evidence," she said. "It is theater." Graham's gaze never left her. "Then the documents will help." Loretta's hand found Nia's in the stillness. Her palm felt cold, but steady. Nia looked at the photograph again where it lay by the recorder. The woman with Loretta's eyes seemed to be smiling at something outside the frame. Some ordinary afternoon before men with plans and signatures decided a block full of lives could be renamed as progress. Arthur's voice returned one more time, lower now, as if he were speaking directly into the grain of the room itself. "If you are listening to me, Graham, do not protect my memory. I buried enough under stone. Protect the people we taught ourselves not to see." The recording clicked off. No dramatic ending. No music. Just the soft mechanical stop and the hush that came after it. For 3 full seconds, no one in the East Hall moved. The chandelier light held steady. Rain traced silver lines down the tall windows. Then, Graham reached for the blue ribbon around the documents and untied it with slow, deliberate fingers, while across the room Evelyn Whitmore took one small step backward as if the floor itself had changed its mind about holding her. The ribbon slid loose from the stack of documents with a whisper so soft it should have disappeared into the room. But in the East Hall, every small sound now seemed to carry. Graham spread the first pages across the walnut table, careful not to smudge the old ink, while the chandelier light fell over legal stamps, signatures, parcel maps, and typed memoranda yellowed at the edges. Nia could not read every line from where she stood, but she could read faces, and faces were saying enough. The silver-haired board member who had spent the afternoon asking for caution leaned in once, then slowly straightened, color draining from his cheeks. A younger attorney beside him adjusted his glasses, scanned one page, then another, and stopped pretending this was still manageable. Loretta moved half a step closer to the table without realizing she had done it, her breath shallow, eyes fixed on a folded survey map that showed an old corridor of storefront lots boxed in red. Franklin Row. The name sat at the top in black machine letters, cold and official, like the city had never imagined the people living there would remember the ink. Graham turned a page, then another. His fingers slowed. The private authorization sheet. The silence that followed was not graceful. It was sharp. Guests shifted. Someone near the fireplace let out a breath too quickly. The attorney reached for the page. Evelyn did not move. Nia watched her with the strange, clear-focused children sometimes had when adults began unraveling in slow, expensive ways. Evelyn's hands remained clasped at her waist, but one thumb kept pressing against the other, once, twice, again, like she was trying to count herself back into control. That document could have been placed there by anyone, Evelyn said. Arthur had a flair for emotional staging. We all know that. No, Graham said, and this time he looked at her directly. We knew he liked being admired. That is not the same thing. Rain traced quiet lines down the long windows. In the reflection, the room looked doubled, twice as elegant, twice as haunted. Nia glanced at the photograph still lying beside the recorder. The woman with Loretta's eyes seemed almost alive under the chandelier glow, captured forever in front of shops that no longer stood. A bakery, a tailor, a pharmacy sign half visible behind a man's shoulder. Not symbols. Lives. The kind rich people turned into neighborhoods on plaques and called that remembrance. Graham lifted another sheet. Complaint log, he read. Filed by business owners. Failure of notice. Improper valuation. Forced utility interruption during active tenancy. The younger attorney closed his eyes for 1 second. There are at least 12 names here, he said quietly. Loretta stepped forward before fear could stop her. Read them, she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. Every head in the hall turned. She stood small and straight in her damp gardener's jacket, with rain still darkening the shoulders and her hands rough from soil and rope and years of touching things that had to survive all seasons. For most of the afternoon, people had looked around her. Now they looked at her. Read the names, she said again. Graham lowered his eyes to the page. He read the first 3, then the 4th, and on the 5th Loretta shut her eyes. Nia felt her grandmother's hand find the table edge as if steady would mattered. That was my father, Loretta said after a moment. He ran the watch repair shop, 2 doors down from my mother's beauty supply store. No one interrupted. The board members did not shuffle. The reporters did not lift their phones. Something older than curiosity had entered the room. They told us the city needed the block for progress, Loretta continued. Then they told us to be grateful for relocation assistance that never covered what was lost. After that, they held a luncheon and called it renewal. Her eyes moved to the photograph. My mother kept that dress for church and funerals. That picture was taken the summer before they started marking sidewalks with paint. Nia looked up at Graham. He was listening with the stillness of someone who finally understood that documents were not the whole truth. Documents were only where truth put on a coat so wealthy people might recognize it. Evelyn let out a careful breath. I did not force anyone out of anything, she said. I advised on financial packaging. That is all. If the city mishandled implementation, that is hardly my crime. Loretta turned toward her then, and the shift in the room was immediate. Not loud, not dramatic, just final in some invisible way. Funny, Loretta said, her voice soft as cloth folded flat. How people with clean nails always call it implementation after other people lose their homes. Evelyn's mouth tightened. You do not know the facts. I know the smell of fresh paint on a boarded door, Loretta replied. I know what it sounds like when a church basement fills with business owners trying not to cry in front of one another. I know my mother died with inventory lists in a shoebox because she thought one day somebody important might finally care what was taken. The words did not rise. They settled. That was worse. Graham looked back down at the documents as though he needed proof to catch up with what he had just heard. Page after page showed side agreements, silent indemnities, asset transfers routed through names built to disappear. Then he reached the memorandum Arthur had mentioned. Thick cream paper. Private distribution. He unfolded it and read the first paragraph in silence. Nia saw the moment something inside him landed. His shoulders lowered, not in relief, but in recognition. Read it, said the silver-haired board member, this time not as an order, not even quite as a request. More like a man hearing the hinge of history and needing to know which way the door would swing. Graham's voice was steady when he began. Confidential summary regarding accelerated acquisition strategy on Franklin Row. Internal note. Certain remaining storefront proprietors continue resisting revised compensation schedule. Recommendation. Proceed through service access pressure and delayed permit review until compliance becomes economically inevitable. He stopped there. The words seemed to stain the air. Nia did not understand every term, but she understood the shape of it. Make staying impossible. then call leaving a choice. Graham kept reading, lower now. Coordination assistance expected through Meriton Corridor Holdings. Advisory confirmation attached. E.D. Whitaker. He lifted his eyes. Whitaker, he said. Your maiden name. Evelyn looked at him without blinking. For the first time since the steel case opened, she dropped the performance entirely. The warmth left her face. So did the grace. What remained was colder and more honest. Yes, she said. A few people inhaled sharply. Nia felt Loretta go rigid beside her. Graham did not shout. He did not slam the papers down. Somehow that made what came next far more frightening to the people who had spent years benefiting from rooms bending around his composure. Did you know before you married my father, he asked, that you were helping clear a black business corridor he later convinced himself he could redeem with foundations and speeches? Evelyn held his gaze. I knew Franklin Row was undervalued land positioned between two growth veins, she said. I knew men with money wanted it, and men in city offices were willing to help them get it. Your father was not tricked, Graham. He was ambitious. He just preferred remorse in private once the cameras arrived. The room recoiled, not because the statement was loud, but because it was too clean, too practiced, like truth after it had lived a long time with no conscience. Graham stood motionless, the memorandum in his hand, while the fire behind him gave a low settling crack and rain kept threading down the windows in silver lines. Nia looked from him to Evelyn and understood that the worst thing under the statue had never been the papers. It was the fact that someone had built a beautiful tribute over a buried confession and expected the world to clap. Graham set the memorandum down very carefully. Then he turned to the chief of security. No one leaves this estate, he said. Call my outside counsel. Then called Detective Helen Cross with County Fraud. Tell her I want her here tonight. Evelyn's eyes changed then, just for a second. Not panic exactly. Something colder. Calculation under pressure. Nia saw it. And in the reflected light of the rain-dark windows, she knew the real storm in that house had not even reached its center yet. Detective Helen Cross arrived just after 6:30, carrying Rain on the shoulders of her dark coat and the kind of quiet that made people step aside without being asked twice. She was in her early 50s, white, sharp-eyed, and dry in the way only certain investigators were dry, as if years of listening to lies had burned all appetite for decoration out of their voices. She did not enter the East Hall like a guest. She entered like a person measuring exits, faces, and the distance between a table full of evidence, and everyone suddenly pretending they had no part in it. The county seal on her badge caught the chandelier light once, and then went still. Graham met her halfway across the room. No handshake. No performance. Just a stack of copied pages already waiting in his hand, the original documents still on the walnut table beside the steel case. Thank you for coming, he said. I want everything documented exactly as found. Detective Cross took the pages, scanned the first one, then looked at the recorder, the photograph, the ribbon, the open case. Her expression did not change, but Nia noticed she took in details the way other people took in weather. Fast. Complete. Who discovered the compartment? She asked. Graham turned slightly. The movement drew every eye in the room toward Nia again. For a second she hated that feeling, the way expensive rooms could suddenly make you feel twice as small just by looking. But then Detective Cross crouched a little, enough to bring her gaze closer to Nia's level without making a show of kindness. Your name? She asked. Nia Brooks, Nia said. 9 years old. Detective Cross nodded once. And you found the brass token in the seam outside? Yes, ma'am. Did anyone tell you what to say before you said it? No, ma'am. Cross studied her face for one beat longer. Not suspicious, just careful. All right. She straightened and turned to Loretta. You are the grandmother? Yes. You stay close. Then she faced the room. From this point on, nobody touches the originals. Nobody leaves until my team photographs the evidence chain and gets statements. If that is inconvenient, you should have thought of that before building secrets into a statue. A few guests looked offended. That did not seem to interest her. Outside, rain moved against the tall windows in soft silver strokes. Inside, the air had changed again. It no longer felt like scandal. It felt procedural, which in some ways was worse. Scandal could be charmed, delayed, wrapped in public relations. Procedure had forms, timestamps, and people who wrote things down. Evelyn understood that too. Nia could tell by the way she had gone quieter, conserving herself. She stood near the fireplace with one hand resting lightly on the mantel, her posture still elegant, but the performance had narrowed. She was not trying to win the room anymore. She was trying to survive it. Detective Cross approached the table and put on thin blue gloves. She examined the recorder without pressing anything, then the memorandum bearing Evelyn's maiden signature, then the redevelopment map. "I know Franklin Row," she said, mostly to herself. "My father used to buy shoe polish from a shop there when I was little." The sentence drifted into the room and settled. Nia saw Loretta look up at her sharply. Cross did not dramatize the memory. She simply laid it down like another fact. "There was a bakery on the corner, too," Loretta said before she meant to. "Peach hand pies in summer." Detective Cross glanced at her. Something faint and human crossed her face. "I remember," she said. Then it was gone. She turned toward Graham. "You have outside copies of estate camera footage from last night. My security chief is pulling them now." "Good. I want every angle from the lawn, east path, greenhouse approach, and memorial staging area between 8 o'clock last night and noon today." The chief of security nodded and left at once. One of the board members tried to step in, voice careful, corporate. "Detective, with respect, there may be donor confidentiality concerns if private gatherings were recorded." Detective Cross looked at him as though he had just announced he was worried about drapes during a house fire. "And there may be fraud, suppression of complaints, falsified land transfers, and obstruction," she said. "I promise you my concern wins." Nobody challenged her after that. Graham remained by the table, one hand braced against the polished wood, eyes lowered to the photograph again. He looked like a man standing beside his own reflection and no longer recognizing the family resemblance. Nia watched him, feeling that strange mixture of fear and certainty growing inside her. The room had begun with him as the most powerful person in it. Now power looked different. Smaller, more fragile. It looked like a man willing to hear something awful and not look away. That mattered, though she was too young to say exactly why. Detective Cross took out a small notepad, wrote the time, then looked at Evelyn. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "I will need a statement regarding Meriden Corridor Holdings, your prior business affiliations under the Whitaker name, and your role in the estate memorial redesign approved after Arthur Whitmore's death." Evelyn did not answer immediately. Firelight moved along the edge of the mirror above the mantel, catching the side of her face. "I would like counsel present," she said at last. "That is your right," Cross replied. "But do not confuse delay with distance." The words were plain, almost gentle, and all the more cutting for it. Nia saw Graham close his eyes briefly at that. Only for a second, as if some last private hope had just been set down and broken open. Then he looked toward Loretta. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, his voice low, "you said your mother kept inventory lists. Do you still have them?" Loretta stared at him, then at the table full of papers that had once seemed unreachable, untouchable, permanent in the way rich people's records always seemed permanent until they wanted them gone. "I do," she said slowly. "In a shoebox. Top shelf of my linen closet. I never threw them out." Detective Cross turned at once. "I want that box picked up tonight." "I will bring it myself," Loretta said. "No," Graham said before he could stop himself, then softened the word. "No, ma'am. You should not have to carry this alone." The sentence hung there, simple and awkward and more sincere than anything he had said all afternoon. Loretta studied him for a long moment, reading not his suit or his name, but his face. "Maybe not," she said. Nia looked from one adult to the other and realized the room had shifted again, not toward comfort, not yet, but toward alignment. Evidence was beginning to find witnesses. Witnesses were beginning to find names. Outside, thunder moved farther off, rolling beyond the hills. Inside, the estate had never felt less secure. Detective Cross finished her note, capped her pen, and nodded toward the recorder. "We are going to make a clean digital copy of that now," she said. "Then I want a second listen with a full transcript." She glanced toward Nia. "And after that, I want to hear from the person who noticed what all of you missed." The hall went still one more time. Nia's stomach tightened. She was only 9. Her coat was still damp. Her shoes were still cheap. The chandeliers still looked like upside-down ice. But when Detective Cross pulled a chair away from the wall and set it near the table, not hidden, not at the edge, but where the light fell clear, Nia understood something the adults were only now learning. The truth had not needed the loudest voice in the room. It had only needed the one person who actually listened. Nia sat in the chair Detective Cross had placed near the walnut table, her feet not quite touching the floor, her damp coat still buttoned to the neck. The East Hall stretched around her in polished silence, all chandeliers and portraits, and old money pretending not to lean in. But it was leaning in. She could feel it in the way conversations had stopped, in the way even the fireplace sounded careful now, each small crackle swallowed by the room before it could become ordinary. Detective Cross sat across from her with a legal pad open on one knee, not smiling, not unkind, simply ready. "Start with last night," she said. "Tell me what you heard before you found the token." Nia nodded once and folded her hands together so no one would see the slight shake in them. "My grandma and I were bringing in garden tarps from the greenhouse path because the storm was coming in fast," she said. "The wind had pulled one of the ties loose near the memorial lawn. I went to fix it. That is when I heard the sound." Cross tilted her head slightly. "What kind of sound?" Nia glanced toward the windows, where rain still traced silver lines in the darkening glass. "Like knocking on a wall that is not solid all the way through," she said. "Not a pipe. Not thunder. It sounded trapped." A few people in the room shifted at that word. Trapped. It fit too many things now. Detective Cross wrote it down. And then, I looked at the base because the black cover had blown a little off one side. I saw the crack. I did not see the brass then because it was too dark. "Did you tell anyone?" "No, ma'am. Not that night." Cross's pen paused. "Why not?" Nia thought about that. There were many answers. Because grown-ups with nice coats usually looked past her. Because girls like her were taught early that being right was not the same as being believed. Because rich places had a way of making even obvious things feel like they belonged to someone else. But she chose the simplest truth. "Because I was not sure yet," she said. Detective Cross gave a small nod, as if that mattered. Maybe it did. Across the room, Graham remained near the table, listening without pretending not to. He had taken off his coat at some point, and without it he looked less protected, his white shirt sleeves slightly creased, his tie loosened half an inch as though the day had pulled formality apart one careful thread at a time. Evelyn stood farther back now, no longer by the fireplace, but near one of the side tables where untouched glasses of sparkling water sat under the chandelier light. She had not asked to leave again. That, too, meant something. Detective Cross looked up from the page. "Tell me about the token this morning." Nia took a breath. When they pulled the cloth off the statue base before the ceremony, the crack looked bigger in daylight. "I saw something brass caught in it. At first I thought it was part of a hinge or a screw cap, but the shape was too round. I waited until no one was near that side. Then I bent down and pulled it out." "Did anyone see you?" "I do not think so." "What did you do when you read it?" Nia looked toward Graham then, not because she meant to, but because there it was again, the image of those 5 words in her palm. "For the one who still listens." "I did not know what it meant," she said softly, "but it felt like it belonged to whoever the statue was really meant for. And then I remembered the sound from the night before." Detective Cross tapped her pen once against the pad. "So you waited until the drill touched the stone?" "Yes, ma'am." "Why wait?" Nia's fingers tightened together. "Because if I said it too early, people would laugh and keep talking over me. But when the drill was right there, they had to stop long enough to hear." For the first time, something like approval moved across Detective Cross's face. Not a smile. More like recognition. "You understood urgency," she said. Nia shrugged one shoulder. "I understood grown-ups." That landed differently. Some people looked down. Others looked at Nia as though they were seeing not a child, but the cost of being ignored too often and learning to plan around it. Loretta stood just behind her chair, one rough hand resting lightly on the wood back, saying nothing. She did not need to. Her presence was its own kind of answer. Detective Cross asked a few more questions. Exact location. Weather. Sequence. Whether Nia had touched anything besides the token. Whether she had spoken to anyone from the estate staff in between. Nia answered each one slowly, carefully, the way her grandmother had taught her to answer school office questions and bus route questions and doctor questions. Plain truth. No decoration. No guessing. When Cross finished writing, she closed the pad and looked around the hall. "Her timeline is clean," she said, "and it matches what we have so far." The room did not exhale, but it changed. Certainty had begun attaching itself to the smallest person in it. Graham stepped closer then. Not so close it would frighten her. Just enough that Nia could see how tired his eyes had become. "Nia," he said, and his voice no longer carried that polished distance it had at the beginning of the day. "Why did you keep going? After security moved, after people laughed, after all of this started getting bigger than a child should have to handle?" Nia looked at him. At the loosened tie. At the rain-dulled shine of the windows behind him. At the family portrait over the fireplace and the open steel case under it, and the documents that had begun to pull names back out of the dark. She thought of the photograph. Of Franklin Rowe. Of Loretta's mother smiling in front of a store that was gone. Of how many adults had probably bent their heads and accepted things because they had jobs to keep and mouths to feed and no proof anyone powerful would hear them anyway. Then she answered in the only way that felt true. "Because your father hid it," she said. "Which means he wanted somebody to find it. And because if something stays buried too long, people start calling it history when it is really just hiding." No one interrupted. Even Evelyn did not. The sentence moved through the room and settled into places documents could not quite reach. Graham looked at Nia for a long moment, and in his expression there was no pity now, no astonishment that a child could speak plainly, only something harder and more humbling. Respect. Detective Cross rose from her chair. "I want the camera footage," she said to the security chief, who had just returned with a drive case in hand. "And I want the original redesign approvals for that memorial, including contractor notes and revision comments." She turned to Graham. "If there was a compartment, someone signed off on structural changes. That leaves a trail." Graham nodded. "Then we follow it." The security chief opened the drive case on the side table and began setting up a screen. Nia slid down from the chair, her legs tingling from sitting still too long. Loretta steadied her with one hand. Warm and firm now despite the cold that had clung to them all afternoon. As the screen flickered to life and security cameras began loading grainy angles of the lawn, the greenhouse path, and the side approach to the memorial, Nia felt that same certainty return, heavier than before. The truth under the statue had been waiting. But whatever came next was not under stone anymore. It was moving. And on the screen, in the pale black and white glow of estate footage, a figure in a white coat was already walking toward the memorial long after midnight. The grainy black and white footage trembled softly on the monitor, timestamp glowing in the bottom corner like a quiet accusation. 12:43 a.m. The memorial lawn was empty except for rain moving across the camera lens in diagonal silver streaks, and the dark shape of the statue, standing in its unfinished drape. Then the side gate opened. A figure in a white coat stepped through the darkness and crossed the lawn with quick, deliberate strides. One hand holding the coat closed at the throat, the other carrying something small and rectangular. No one in the East Hall spoke. They did not need to. The outline alone was enough. The posture, the gait, the pale brightness of the coat against the storm-dark grounds. Evelyn Whitmore watched herself on the screen without blinking, and that was somehow worse than denial. Detective Cross moved closer to the monitor, hands in the pockets of her coat, eyes narrowed. "Freeze it there," she said. The security chief paused the footage just as the figure reached the base of the statue. Pixelated rain hung in the air like ash. Graham stood beside the screen now, jaw set, shirt sleeves rolled once at the forearms, no trace left of the polished host from earlier that afternoon. "That is you," he said, not as a question. Evelyn did not answer immediately. She kept her eyes on the frozen image, chin slightly lifted, as if sheer posture could still hold back consequence. "I went outside because I could not sleep," she said at last. A memorial in this weather felt exposed. "I wanted to check the covering." Detective Cross let the excuse hang there for a second, then nodded toward the object in Evelyn's hand. "And the case?" The room stayed still enough for the fire to sound loud behind them. On the screen, the shape in Evelyn's hand was not clear, but it was there. Flat, compact, measured enough to fit in a coat pocket. Evelyn finally looked away from the monitor. "I do not know what that is from this angle." "But you know it is not the tarp tie," Graham said. His voice was low, almost tired now, and that tiredness made it sharper. Detective Cross gestured to the security chief. "Run it." The footage moved again. Evelyn's midnight figure knelt by the pedestal, half hidden by the draped cloth and the angle of the camera. For 12 long seconds she stayed there, shoulders moving with the small, precise motions of someone placing, retrieving, or checking something near the base. Then she stood, glanced once toward the house, and walked back across the lawn, white coat flashing in the rain before the darkness took her. The timestamp advanced. 12:44 a.m. That was all. No dramatic reveal. No obvious crime. Just presence where there should have been none and secrecy where none should have been needed. Detective Cross extended a hand. I want the camera from the opposite corner. Another feed loaded, this one farther back, partially blocked by hedges. The image was worse, but the angle showed something the first one had not. As the white-coated figure bent near the base, a second shape moved briefly into frame from the service path. Smaller, dark jacket, cap pulled low. The person stopped near the pedestal for less than 3 seconds, handed something over, then retreated into the rain. Nia felt Loretta's fingers tighten around her shoulder again. The East Hall seemed to contract around the monitor. Who is that? Asked the silver-haired board member. Detective Cross did not take her eyes off the footage. That, she said, is why I asked for contractor notes. Graham turned to the security chief. Identify every person with grounds access last night. Staff, temp workers, maintenance, memorial contractors. Everyone. Already started, sir. Do not call me sir tonight, Graham said. Call me when you have names. The chief gave one quick nod and stepped away with his phone. Evelyn drew in a breath, slow and measured. You are building a fantasy out of rain and poor camera angles, she said. If someone from the grounds crew approached me, it could have been about the tarp, the footing, anything. You are all desperate to make the ugliest version true. Loretta made a quiet sound then, not quite a laugh. Funny, she said, eyes still on the screen. How the ugly version always seems to recognize itself first. Evelyn turned toward her with a look colder than anything she had shown all day. You should be very careful what you imply. Graham moved before Loretta could answer. Not abruptly, not theatrically, simply stepping into the line between them in a way that changed the room all over again. It was not just protection. It was position. Sides, finally, made visible. No, he said to Evelyn, and there was something final in it now. She has been careful for years. That is the problem. The words settled into the hall with a weight no chandelier could soften. Detective Cross asked for the footage to be replayed a third time, slower. This time everyone saw the same thing near the end of the clip. As Evelyn's figure turned from the statue, her hand rose briefly to the front of her coat, then disappeared into the pocket. When she walked away, the rectangular shape was gone. Whatever she had carried out there had not come back with her. Cross looked toward the open steel case on the walnut table, then to the pedestal plans among the documents, then back to the screen. Either she placed something, she said, or she checked that something already placed was still there. Graham's face lost what little color remained. The brass token. Detective Cross nodded once. Maybe. Or maybe something else was meant to stay hidden until the ceremony buried it permanently. Nia looked at the case, at the recorder, at the map of Franklin Row, at the photograph of Loretta's mother. The house felt too bright now, too polished to hold what was surfacing inside it. Across the room, an assistant hurried in with a thin folder and handed it to the security chief, who passed it straight to Graham. Preliminary access roster, he said. Graham opened it, scanning the typed names. Halfway down the first page, his eyes stopped. No, he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. Detective Cross stepped closer. What is it? Graham turned the folder so she could see. Marcus Bell, he said. Memorial Stone subcontractor. Hired 3 weeks ago. Loretta inhaled sharply. Nia looked up at her grandmother. You know him? Detective Cross asked. Loretta's expression had gone hard in a way Nia had only seen twice before, both times when old Payne came back wearing a familiar face. I know his mother, Loretta said. And I know his grandfather had a hardware store on Franklin Row before the city squeezed him out. Detective Cross held out her hand for the roster. Then either he was helping bury history, she said, or helping it surface. Graham stared at the screen where Evelyn's midnight figure stood frozen again beside the statue, white coat luminous in the rain like guilt refusing to wash away. Then he looked toward the front doors as if measuring the dark beyond them. Find Marcus Bell, he said, before anyone else does. And just then, as if the house itself had been waiting for the moment to choose sides, the lights flickered once, twice, and the East Hall dropped into a breathless half-dark where only the monitors still glowed, illuminating Evelyn's face in black and white, while a phone began ringing somewhere in the service corridor, and nobody moved quickly enough to stop the sound. The ringing in the service corridor went on just long enough to make everyone in the East Hall aware of how fragile quiet really was. One shrill burst, then another, thin and electric against the dimmed chandeliers, and the rain-heavy hush pressing at the windows. The lights steadied after their brief flicker, but the room had changed. It no longer felt like a house holding a gathering. It felt like a vault that had been opened from the inside. The security chief answered the phone near the side doors, listened for 3 seconds, then turned toward Graham with a face that gave the news away before his mouth did. "Marcus Bell is gone," he said. No one spoke at first. The sentence simply entered the room and found its place beside the recorder, the documents, the midnight footage, and the photograph on the table. Graham stood very still, his hand half curled at his side as though he had reached for something invisible and found only air. "Gone where?" Detective Cross asked. The gate camera caught a contractor truck leaving through the North Service exit 20 minutes before county units arrived, the chief said. "The log shows Bell signed out early for equipment issues. Nobody flagged it because the ceremony was still active." Cross held out her hand. "Plate number." The chief passed over a small slip of paper already torn from a pad. Cross read it, folded it once, and slid it into her coat pocket. "Alert the county dispatcher," she said. Quietly. "I do not want him spooked into disappearing farther." Evelyn shifted her weight near the side table, the only visible sign that the name had struck somewhere tender. Nia saw it at once. Just a tightening at the throat. A blink that came late. The kind of reaction adults hoped children would miss, because children were supposed to be distracted by surfaces. Nia never was. Graham saw it too. "You know him better than you admitted," he said. Evelyn looked at him with that same cold clarity she had shown before, but now there was strain in it, like polished glass under too much pressure. "I know many contractors by file, not by intimacy," she replied. "This estate employs people, Graham. That has never been a crime." Detective Cross did not waste time on the sentence. "Did you speak to him last night?" she asked. "No." "Did you meet him near the memorial?" "No." "Then why did the footage show a second figure approach you?" Evelyn's answer came a fraction too fast. "The image was not clear. Your denial is." Cross's voice stayed flat, almost gentle again, and all the more cutting for it. Nia looked up at Loretta. Her grandmother's eyes were no longer on Evelyn or the screen. They were on the rain-blurred windows, seeing somewhere else entirely. Franklin Row, maybe. A hardware store. A family name carried forward into a grandson who now appeared in midnight footage beside a buried confession. The past had not stayed buried. It had kept hiring children. It had kept collecting descendants. Graham turned back to the roster folder, scanning the lines beneath Marcus Bell's name. "Address on file is downtown," he said. "Temporary apartment paid through the memorial subcontract." Cross stepped beside him. "Who approved the subcontract?" Graham flipped to the back page, and the answer found him before he finished reading. He gave a small, humorless exhale. "The redesign committee signed off as a block." He lifted his eyes to Evelyn. "Committee chair, Evelyn Whitmore." For the first time that evening, a true murmur broke through the hall, not shocked enough to be noisy, but real enough to spread. The board members exchanged looks. The younger attorney lowered his head as though he wished paper could erase memory. Loretta took one step forward, boots soft against the polished floor. "You brought in the grandson of a man whose store was taken," she said, the words quiet and clean. "And you put him to work under the statue built over the papers." Evelyn's gaze snapped to her. "You are inventing motive because you need a villain simple enough to comfort you." "No," Loretta said. "I just know people who have been used when I see one." Graham closed the roster and laid it down on the table with more care than force. That was becoming his new way of handling rage. Not explosion. Precision. Nia understood by now that controlled anger frightened rooms like this more than shouting ever could. "If Marcus Bell helped you," Graham said, "then he was either loyal, desperate, or both." Evelyn held his eyes. Or maybe he was ashamed of what his grandfather lost and wanted a piece of the only wealth left in reach. "Have you considered that? Not every descendant of harm grows up noble, Graham. Some grow up practical." The sentence landed hard. Too hard. Nia felt Loretta go rigid again. Detective Cross lifted one hand slightly, not to protect Evelyn, only to stop the room from turning into something less useful than truth. Enough, she said. We do not speculate moral character when we do not yet have a statement. Then she turned to Graham. I want that apartment secured, any estate-issued devices flagged, and every contractor invoice copied. Especially the redesign revisions on the pedestal. Graham nodded toward the security chief, who was already moving. The East Hall had become a machine now, old money and new evidence grinding against each other, every polished surface reflecting a history the Whitmores had tried to keep decorative. Nia's eyes drifted back to the photograph on the table. Loretta's mother still smiled from it, forever caught in sunlight that no longer existed, in front of a row of businesses long erased, and now creeping back through tape hiss, legal paper, and a child's warning. Graham followed Nia's gaze, and, for a moment, his face changed in a way no one else in the room seemed ready to name. Shame, yes, but also understanding. The kind that arrived too late and still had to do something with itself. Mrs. Brooks, he said quietly. Loretta looked at him. If Marcus Bell is connected to Franklin Rowe through his family, then this is bigger than my father's guilt and Evelyn's paper trail. It means someone from that block was pulled back into the cleanup. Loretta's mouth tightened. That is how these things survive, she said. The people hurt by the first lie get hired to carry the second one because rent still comes due. The words settled heavily. Even Detective Cross looked at her for a long second before nodding once, as if a missing piece of structure had just clicked into place. Then the security chief returned, carrying a slim tablet still damp from his rush through the service corridor. Sir, he said, forgetting the correction in his urgency, we pulled Bell's onboarding packet from archives. There is a reference note attached from a private consultant, not a state staff. He handed the tablet to Graham. Graham read the screen, then passed it straight to Cross. Read the consultant name, he said. Cross scanned the page. Her eyes sharpened. Whitaker Advisory Group, she said. The room went still all over again. Evelyn did not move this time. She did not deny it either. She simply looked at the rain on the windows as though she had run out of versions of the story that would still hold. Graham took one slow breath. That company was dissolved 15 years ago. On paper, Cross said. Which is exactly why I am suddenly very interested. Nia watched Evelyn's reflection in the dark glass. It looked thinner than the real woman, harder somehow, stripped of charm by rain and distance. Did you recruit him? Graham asked. Did you bring Marcus Bell here because his name connected him to a block you thought no one in this house would remember? Evelyn turned from the window at last. When she spoke, the softness was gone for good. I brought him because people from broken places understand silence better than people raised in mansions. Nia felt the sentence move through the room like cold water. It told on more than she meant it to. Detective Cross stepped forward at once. Thank you, she said. That is the first honest thing you have said all night. The East Hall did not erupt. It did not need to. Truth, once it reached the center of a room, rarely shouted. It simply made every polished lie look cheap. Graham looked at Evelyn as though seeing not his father's widow, not the woman who had managed the estate and hosted donor dinners and smiled under chandeliers, but the architecture of avoidance itself. Then he turned to Detective Cross. I am done protecting the house, he said. Do whatever you need. Cross nodded. Then I need one more thing tonight. She held up the tablet. I need to know where Marcus Bell thought he was delivering that silence. Nia did not fully understand the sentence, but she understood the feeling under it. The truth under the statue had opened one door. Marcus Bell was another. And somewhere beyond the rain-dark windows, in a contractor truck heading away from the estate, a man carrying the name of a lost block might be driving with the last missing piece of what Arthur Whitmore had tried, too late, to unbury. County Dispatch called back at 7:12 p.m. The contractor truck had been located 23 miles north of the estate at a gas station off Route 17, parked under a row of buzzing canopy lights that turned wet pavement the color of old tin. Marcus Bell was inside the convenience store when deputies arrived. He had not run. That detail moved through the East Hall in a strange way, softer than panic, sharper than relief. Detective Cross took the call herself, listening with one hand braced against the walnut table, her face unreadable except for a slight tightening near the eyes. Do not press him there, she said into the phone. Bring him in dry. Keep him separate. and do not mention the recorder until I get there." She ended the call and looked at Graham. He is alive, cooperative for now, and he did not make it far. Evelyn let out a breath that almost sounded like disappointment. Nia caught it. So did Graham. The room did not miss much anymore. "I am going with you," Graham said. Detective Cross shook her head once. "No, you are not a witness in a clean enough way tonight. You are the son of the man in the recording, the owner of the estate, and the target of whatever your father tried to leave behind. Stay here. Protect the originals. Let me do my job." Graham's jaw tightened, but he nodded. That, too, was new. A man used to directing outcomes, now standing still, while someone else carried the next piece of truth toward him. Cross turned to Loretta. "Mrs. Brooks, can you get me that shoebox tonight?" "Yes." "Good. I want it logged before midnight." Then she looked at Nia, and her voice lost none of its steadiness, but some small edge in it softened. "You did enough today." Nia did not answer. Enough was a strange word. The day had started with a statue and rain and people laughing. Now the room smelled like wet wool, old paper, and something more difficult to name. Exposure, maybe. The kind that stripped polish off a family faster than thunder ever could. Detective Cross left with 2 deputies and the original roster copy. The East Hall seemed larger after she was gone, but not calmer. More like the room had been holding itself upright because procedure was in it, and now it had to depend on people again. Graham moved back to the table and looked down. At the photograph, the memorandum, the recorder, and the stack of documents fanned beneath chandelier light. Nia watched him for a long moment. There was no anger left on his face now, not the kind that looked outward. What remained was worse and more honest. A man finding out how much of his inheritance had been made from absence, and then deciding whether remorse would become another performance or something heavier than that. Evelyn stood near the tall windows, her reflection cut by rain. Her white coat had finally lost its brightness under the hall lights. It looked gray now, almost tired, like fabric that had spent too long pretending to be clean. "You will regret making a spectacle of this," she said without turning around. "Not because I am wrong. Because the public does not know how to hold complexity. They will flatten your father into a villain and your family into a headline." Graham looked at her, and when he answered, his voice was so quiet the room had to lean in again. "Maybe we should have thought about that before flattening other people's lives into redevelopment maps." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. "You think this is justice because it hurts?" "No," Graham said. "I think it is truth because it was buried." Loretta took Nia's hand then. "We should get the shoebox," she murmured. Nia nodded, but before they could step away, Graham crossed the room toward them. He stopped a respectful distance back, like he understood all at once that nearness was not something his name could purchase. "Mrs. Brooks," he said. "Nia." He paused there, as if even using her name required care now. "Whatever happens next, I do not want county officers showing up at your apartment without support. I can send a driver and 1 female deputy with you, if that would make this easier." Loretta studied him. "You think a car makes old papers lighter?" she asked. There was no cruelty in it, only memory. Graham lowered his eyes for half a second. "No, ma'am," he said. "I think carrying them alone would be too much to ask after everything my family already took." The sentence hung in the room with a kind of stillness that did not come from wealth. It came from humility, awkward and late, but real enough to be recognized when it arrived. Loretta's expression shifted just slightly. Not forgiveness. Nothing that easy. But the refusal in her shoulders eased. "All right," she said. 1 deputy. No sirens. No parade. Done. Nia looked up at Graham then. "Are you going to take the statue down?" she asked. The question slipped out before she could weigh it, and once it was in the room, no one seemed willing to pretend it did not belong there. Graham turned his head toward the rain-dark windows, toward the lawn beyond them, where Arthur Whitmore still stood above the hollow base with his bronze hand lifted like blessing or warning, depending on who was looking. "Yes," he said at last. "Not tonight. But yes." Evelyn gave a short laugh, brittle as glass under cold water. "And replace it with what?" "A plaque apologizing for inherited wealth." Graham faced her again. "No," he said, "with an empty space." The answer seemed to catch even him by surprise, but once spoken, it settled into the room as though it had been waiting there too. An empty space. Not a monument. Not another polished revision. Just absence made visible. Loretta nodded once, almost to herself. That would be a start. An assistant brought umbrellas. Another quietly collected untouched glasses from the side table, the soft clink of crystal sounding oddly small against the weight of the night. The board members had stopped trying to manage optics. The reporters, still held in the west corridor under supervision, were no longer the center of anything. The center now was a child in worn sneakers, a shoebox on a linen shelf waiting to be opened, a contractor in county custody, and a billionaire learning that the hardest thing about inherited power was not losing it. It was seeing exactly what it had been standing on. As Loretta and Nia prepared to leave through the side entrance with the deputy, Graham stepped aside for them, not ceremoniously, simply moving out of their path as one person should for another. Nia passed him and smelled rain, smoke from the fireplace, and the faint metallic scent of old paper drying under chandelier heat. At the doorway she glanced back. Graham Whitmore was standing beside the walnut table again, one hand resting near the black and white photograph, his father's voice recorder beside it like a pulse that had not quite finished speaking. Across the hall, Evelyn stood alone in the reflected rain, no longer framed as family, only as a woman who had run out of stories. And in that long, polished room full of expensive light, Nia understood something she would not have known how to say out loud. The statue outside had not started cracking when the workers opened the pedestal. It had started cracking the moment one little girl decided not to let the drill drown out what she heard beneath it. The shoebox smelled faintly of cedar, old paper, and lavender sachets that had long since given up trying to make grief smell gentle. It sat on the walnut table just before 9 o'clock, its corners softened by years on a linen shelf, its lid warped slightly from summer heat and time. Loretta stood beside it with rain-dried silver into the seams of her gardener's jacket, one hand flat on the cardboard top, as if memory might spill out too quickly if she lifted it without warning. Nia stood close enough to feel the warmth of her grandmother's sleeve. Across from them, Graham Whitmore had changed nothing about his appearance except drying off. His shirt was still creased from the long evening, his tie still loosened, his face still carrying the kind of exhaustion money could not smooth over. Detective Cross had returned 10 minutes earlier with county evidence bags, a digital recorder, and a look that said the night was no longer drifting. It was landing. Marcus Bell talked, she said before anyone asked. The East Hall held still around the words. Even Evelyn, seated now in a high-backed chair near the windows with counsel finally beside her, looked up sharply. Cross opened her notebook. He says Evelyn hired him through a dormant consulting shell tied to Whitaker Advisory Group. She told him there were rumors the pedestal contained old estate documents, and that if he found anything during the redesign, he was to notify her first, not the general contractor, not the estate office. Graham did not move. And last night, Cross turned one page. He says she met him at the memorial after midnight because he told her a hidden cavity existed behind the front panel. He had discovered the false depth while installing the new reinforcement anchors last week. She paid him to leave the cavity sealed and to say nothing. He claims he did not know what was inside until she opened the panel. Enough to pull out the brass token and check for contents. Nia felt Loretta's fingers brush the back of her neck, light and absent-minded, the way she did when old pain was trying to come through her skin. Did he say why he talked now? Graham asked. Cross looked toward Loretta before answering. Because once he heard Franklin Rowe named in that hall, he realized whose history he had helped bury. His grandfather was Samuel Bell, hardware store on the west end of the block. He said his grandmother kept one photograph from before the closure and a story about men in polished shoes promising progress, while the rent notices came faster than the permits. Loretta closed her eyes once, slowly. Samuel fixed my father's watch band for free the week before they shut our power off, she said. No one interrupted. Cross continued. Marcus says Evelyn planned to let the ceremony happen with the cavity sealed and the token gone. The documents would remain hidden until weather and time finished what silence started. But after the storm shifted the covering and the brass slipped into the crack, she went out to check whether anything else had surfaced. Evelyn's attorney leaned forward at once, voice clean and measured. An uncorroborated contractor statement made under pressure is not dispositive. Detective Cross barely glanced at him. That is why I asked for the shoebox. The room turned gently toward Loretta. She lifted the lid. Inside were inventory sheets, folded city notices, receipt books, two church fans, a postcard of a storefront with Christmas lights in the window, and beneath them, tied with faded thread, a stack of handwritten pages. The paper had browned at the edges. The ink on top was neat, deliberate, written by someone who knew one day she might need strangers to believe her. Loretta touched the first page with 2 fingers. My mother wrote down everything after the meeting started, she said. Dates. Names. What was promised. What was taken. She said paper forgets slower than people do. Nia looked at the page as Cross carefully lifted it free. At the top, written in blue ink, were the words, Record of notices and visitors regarding Franklin Row relocation. Cross read in silence for a few seconds, then laid the page flat beneath the table lamp. There is a name here, she said. Edith Whitaker, financial liaison. Preliminary acquisition visit. The hall went very quiet. Not the shocked quiet from earlier. Something older, heavier. The kind that arrived when truth stopped being circumstantial and started becoming lineage. Evelyn's face did not collapse. It emptied. For the first time all night, she looked less like a strategist and more like a woman who had spent years outrunning a mirror and just now realized it had been waiting in the house all along. Graham's eyes moved from the page to Evelyn and stayed there. Your mother, he said. It was not an accusation. It was worse. Recognition. Evelyn's lips parted, then closed again. Her attorney began to speak, but she lifted one hand and silenced him without looking away from Graham. Yes, she said. The single word made the room colder than the rain ever had. Cross turned another page. There are meeting notes. Utility interruptions. Revised compensation numbers. A mention of Edith Whitaker returning with a younger assistant named Evelyn. Loretta let out a thin breath that shook on the way out. You were there, she said, and her voice carried no rise, no tremor, just the plain horror of memory aligning. You stood in our shop while my mother was counting stock by hand. Evelyn looked at her then. Really looked. Whatever shield had held all evening was gone. I was 22, she said. I thought I was entering finance. I thought cities changed and weak businesses failed, and that was simply the language of progress. And later, Graham asked, when you were no longer 22? Evelyn's eyes dropped to the shoebox, to the receipts, to the careful handwriting, to the evidence that the people on Franklin Row had not been voiceless, only ignored. Later, she said, I told myself there was no point reopening a wound if the people who benefited were already living inside the result. Graham closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the softness that had once protected his public image was gone for good. What remained was cleaner than anger. A line, finally drawn. That is the sentence of every coward who mistakes comfort for peace, he said. No one rushed to fill the silence after that. The fire had burned low. Rain had thinned outside to a mist that silvered the estate windows without sound. The chandeliers glowed above them, too bright for the hour, making the old paper on the table seem almost holy in its fragility. Detective Cross sealed the inventory sheets and Loretta's mother's notes into evidence sleeves one by one, reading dates and descriptions aloud. Marcus Bell's statement would be added by midnight. The recorder had already been transcribed. The land transfer files were copied. The memorial redesign approvals were bagged. Step by step, the house that had once hidden everything in polished drawers and bronze tribute was being translated into chain of custody. Graham walked to the windows at last and looked out toward the lawn. The statue was visible through the damp dark, lit from below by landscape lights that now made it seem less majestic than stranded. Bronze shoes, bronze hand, bronze certainty. Beneath it, the opened pedestal panel stood ajar like a mouth that had finally admitted what it had swallowed. Nia came to stand near him without meaning to. She was small beside the glass, her reflection barely reaching his shoulder. For a while neither of them said anything. Then Graham spoke, low enough that the room behind them faded. I used to think inheritance meant receiving something, he said. Tonight it feels like being handed a debt with my family's name carved into it. Nia looked out at the statue, then at the dark shape of the empty lawn around it. Then maybe do not build over it again, she said. Graham turned toward her, and for the first time that day the look on his face held no surprise at all when she spoke. Only listening. Behind them, county deputies moved quietly around the table. Cross zipped evidence bags. Loretta stood with the shoebox lid in her hands, not smiling, not healed, but no longer carrying the whole thing alone. Evelyn sat very still while her attorney whispered next steps that sounded small in a room where the real next steps had already begun. Graham looked back through the rain-soft glass. The statue comes down at first light, he said. He did not announce it to the room. He did not make a speech. But the words carried anyway. Cross nodded once without pausing her paperwork. Loretta closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. Evelyn said nothing. Nia pressed her palm lightly to the cool window and watched the lawn lights halo the mist. First light came pale and thin over the estate, turning the soaked grass silver and the sky the color of worn paper. By 6:30 the work crew was back, quieter than the day before. No press, no donors, no white tents, no memorial music. Just boots in wet grass, the hum of machinery, and the low metal groan of bolts releasing what had once been called permanent. Loretta stood beside Nia in her green jacket. Graham stood a few feet away in a dark coat with no umbrella even though dew and mist gathered on his shoulders. When the statue finally lifted, it did not rise like glory. It rose like weight. Mud marked the place where it had stood. The open cavity beneath the pedestal showed dark for one last second before the workers moved to seal the foundation for removal. No plaque replaced it. No new stone waited under a tarp. Only an empty square of earth, damp and honest in the weak morning light. Birds landed first. 2 robins, hopping near the edge as if the ground had become reachable again. Nia noticed them before anyone else. Of course she did. Graham followed her gaze and let out a breath that looked like surrender and beginning all at once. The estate was quieter without the bronze figure claiming the lawn. Less certain. More true. Loretta slipped her hand into Nia's and squeezed once. Behind them, the house stood with all its windows open to morning, no longer able to pretend it had slept through any of this. Graham looked down at the empty space, then at Nia. When he spoke, his voice was rough from a night without rest, but steadier than it had been at any hour before. He built a statue for power, he said. You uncovered the truth beneath it. Nia looked back at the earth where the marble base had been, at the robins near the edge, at the light spreading slowly over a place that no longer had anything left to hide. And in the cool hush of that new morning, with mist rising off the grass and old silence finally broken, the empty space said what no monument ever had. The truth was never missing. It was buried where no one wanted to kneel.